Morning, Minister. Thank you very much for giving us your time.
Good morning, Judge and panel.
I just ask you if you'll affirm that what you tell us will be the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth, which so I do.
Should I stand up?
No.
I affirm.
Should we just take the name and swear in the other witness?
Sorry, is someone else going to talk to us as well?
Yes, I have with me the coordinator for the Border Management Authority, Mr. Elroy Africa, who is going to, in case there are issues relating to that topic, who is also going to be a witness on the topic.
Will you also affirm what you said will be the truth, the whole truth?
Yes, I do, Judge.
Will you say I do?
I do. Thank you.
Minister Gigaba, thank you for coming.
It's my pleasure.
You were the Minister of Finance between 31 March 2017 and 27 February 2018.
Indeed.
Our understanding is that it was during that period that you, in fact, initiated or called for this Commission of Inquiry. And I wonder if you could tell us why you thought it was necessary to do so.
Thank you very much. It is true that during the course of that term, I don't remember the date exactly, I made a call for the Commission of Inquiry into the South African Revenue Service. At the time, we were concerned about various issues. The economy was in distress. There were various concerns that were being raised with me in the various roadshows, both domestic and international, that I had undertaken about the integrity of the Revenue Service, which had to do with public perception and investor perception of the institution. They related to governance, they related to perception which had to do with its integrity. We had experienced a significant revenue shortfall amounting to about 50.9, close to 51 billion rand under collection. They related to illicit financial flows. They also related to tax morality, to a declining tax morality. And from what we were picking up, the tax morality issues were not merely about people just maliciously evading tax payments, but it was also people saying we will not pay taxes so long as there are credibility issues relating to the institution. And so I thought in order to deal with those challenges, we need not just issue statements reassuring the public and the various stakeholders that the institution was stable, in good hands, and credible. We needed a process that would itself be credible, overseen by a judge, which would dive deep into the challenges that the institution was facing, at the end of which would emerge with recommendations that would address governance, credibility issues, the integrity matters, and any other issues emanating from the process, which would assure the investors, the ratings agencies, the international financial institutions, the tax-paying public, that indeed the institution was either in good hands, that the public perception was wrong, or if the public perception was correct, then which would propose far-reaching measures that would address those perceptions. But it seemed to me that there were prima facie issues that were valid. The institution had not had prior to my appointment as Minister of Finance, and to some extent even during my tenure as Minister of Finance, had not had a good relationship, particularly with the National Treasury. And so we needed to address those issues, particularly to address the issues of governance, of relations between the institution and the National Treasury, between the Commissioner and the Minister of Finance, and the triangular relationship between the President, the Minister of Finance, and the Commissioner of the South African Revenue Service. We needed to address all of those issues to resolve the conundrum, to clarify the roles and responsibilities. Because even if you look at the legislation, the SARS legislation, it indicates that the Commissioner is appointed by the Minister of Finance, but as it were, it is common cause that heads of departments and heads of entities are appointed and accountable to the President, and it's a delegated function. And so we needed to resolve that conundrum. And so I thought we needed a commission which would address all of those issues, provide clarity, smoothen the relationship between the National Treasury and the Commission and SARS, and between the Minister of Finance and the Commissioner of the South African Revenue Service. And that is why I made the proposal. And so I thought it would be far-reaching and would address not only the credibility issues and public perception, but would resolve also the governance matters and assist us to know how to manage this relationship going forward.
Minister, just to pause at the credibility issue, you sent me a file of documents really supporting your view that there was internationally becoming a credibility problem. And I just want to read into the record 2 short extracts to give a flavor to what you're talking about. The first one is a World Bank systematic country diagnostic, which was published on the 30th of April 2018, but it was actually developed during Minister Gigaba's term as Minister of Finance. And under a heading called Strengthening Accountability, it says, the impact of state capture has been pervasive, but strong political leadership could reverse it. Until very recently, corrupt political interests have not only undermined the investigative independence of the South African Revenue Service, but also disabled the National Prosecuting Authority, which failed to take any substantive action in response to either the Gupta revelations or the evidence in the Public Protector's report of state capture, etc. So I note there that it's the undermining of the investigative independence of SARS that had come to the attention of the World Bank. And indeed, Minister, you were right, because we certainly have had evidence that is the case, that it was undermined in this commission. And the second report I want to refer to is called Sovereign Risk Pulse. And this is feedback from the rating agencies, S&P, Standard & Poor, Moody's, and Fitch Sovereign Credit Ratings Review meeting. And it's dated 31 October 2017 to 8 November 2017. And one of the paragraphs in this report says, fiscal policy. The paths of fiscal consolidation and debt stabilization are heavily exposed to low economic growth and huge tax revenue shortfalls. The 2017 MTBPS revised down the tax revenue for 2017 by 50.8 billion, the largest shortfall since 2009. The MTBPS also announced that the expenditure could be breached by 3.9 million in 27 as a result of the recapitalization of SAA and the Post Office. Given this, rating agencies' focus was on government strategies in closing the revenue gaps, as well as the role of the Presidential Fiscal Commission in sustaining public finances. The following questions underpin the discussions. And the first one is how the gaps in the tax revenue will be closed. Do I understand correctly that that is the type of perception that you were talking about, Minister?
Indeed, among others, these were the issues that we were gravely worried about. And that's why we thought you can't address those issues merely by issuing statements and reassurances. You needed a credible institution of the type of a commission to be able to provide such reassurances. And even though we were doing the work we were doing to respond to the gaps that we were seeing that we announced in the MTBPS, because the medium-term budget policy statement was quite partly a departure from how the MTBPS would have been done previously, in that whereas you would have announced a tax, a revenue shortfall, you would also announce measures to address those shortfalls. In the 2017 MTBPS, we announced this significant gap and said we would respond to this significant gap through the Presidential Fiscal Committee and the announcements that we would make in the budget 2018, which we did. But the ratings agencies and the international and domestic investor community were concerned that you are not giving us something to hold on to. We don't know if you are giving up on the path of fiscal consolidation and the management of your fiscal framework and debt management. And looking at our debt projection over the medium term, we realized that if we allowed it to proceed the way without consolidating it was going to escalate beyond 60% in 3 years' time. And so they needed us to do something more drastic that would indicate our decisive and bold action on our part, but that we could deal with internally. And that is why we had to announce the measures we announced in the budget in 2018. But there was something that needed to be done by the tax authorities, because ultimately a large part of the revenue of the state comes from the tax authorities, the collection of revenue. And for us to be able to collect the revenue for the state, we needed to fix the credibility, the administration, the governance of our tax administration. And so to do that, we didn't only need to reform the tax administration, we had to deal with the credibility of the institution. We could take the step of tinkering with the leadership, but we felt that there was something more we needed to do to address the credibility of the institution, so that we provide a more profound, more in-depth approach going forward. And that is why we made the proposal of a commission.
Well, the consistent evidence we've heard here is that a significant portion of that 50.8 billion can be attributed to administrative problems in SARS. So it seems like you were correct.
A significant portion of it, indeed, and an underperforming economy. And I think that also came out very sharply. I think it remains a concern if you look at where the state of our economy is, even at the present moment. There is that concern, because ultimately, until you achieve significant growth, the question remains, and significant employment, the question remains, where are you going to collect your revenues? Because people are not employed, incomes are not rising, the economy is not growing, people, the sectors, both corporates and income earners that are supposed to pay taxes are not there. But then, you know, we don't have the sufficient capacity to combat illicit financial flows. People are raising questions about the credibility of tax administration. So yes, indeed, that remains a significant contributor to revenue collection.
Judge and panel, I'm about to move on to asking the Minister about the governance question and the relationship between the Ministry and SARS. Before I do so, do you want to ask questions on this topic?
Could I ask two? Minister, that was very helpful.
You say repeatedly there were these concerns. We thought we needed a commission. We thought we couldn't just tinker. Who was we?
It was the Minister of Finance, the National Treasury. We had an agreement. I tabled these proposals to the President, the former President, who had agreed with me. I tabled the same proposals to the new President, President Ramaphosa, who also agreed with me, and I think he then acted promptly in announcing and actioning the commission, and that's why the commission was subsequently and promptly established.
Just one other one. Minister, you said there were these perceptions that all is not right at SARS and credibility. Leave aside the perceptions. Your own feeling as Minister, as the responsible Minister for SARS, what was your feeling about what was happening at SARS?
I shared the same concerns, and that's why I did not dismiss the concerns. I shared the same concerns, and that's why I acted the way I did, and with the determination and resolve that I did.
Minister, just following up, the concerns that you shared, were they ever raised with the Commissioner and leadership of SARS by yourself?
I did raise those concerns with the Commissioner on several occasions, including when I first briefed him about my intention to propose a commission to the President. I discussed the issue of the commission with the Commissioner twice, and I raised the issue of my concerns with him, I think, on more than 2 occasions, beyond the issue of the commission, of the establishment of a commission of inquiry itself.
Minister, may I just ask you 2 things? From the evidence we've heard thus far,
And there may still be a lot of evidence to hear. There are 2 things that have stood out for me, and that is the relationship between SARS and, on the one hand, Treasury, Auditor General, Financial Intelligence Service, and it seems to be, from that evidence, it seems to be a solid relationship. I mean, I've never heard of one government or enterprise taking the other one to a court, for example, especially if it's the Auditor General, which has happened here. And there seems to be little communication with Treasury. The other is we've heard repeatedly evidence here from people, senior management who work here, of the unhappiness that exists.
now you talked about
Tinkering with leadership. It seems to me those are very fundamental problems for leadership. In other words, they emanate from leadership. So I'm not quite sure why you talk about tinkering. Isn't in an organization, the leadership sets the tone for the whole organization. So it's a very fundamental thing, is leadership. Do you agree with that?
Absolutely. I use the word tinkering with leadership because you can tinker with leadership. You can change them. You can change the musical chairs, but unless you address the fundamental problems that result in the problems emanating, the problems will keep arising. You will change leadership, and the problems will remain, and you will change leadership, and the problems are not addressed. So you need to address the problem at various levels. One, you need the leadership at all institutions to be matured enough to be able to work with one another. You need that maturity at the level of leaders, whether they like one another. I mean, by the time we meet as leaders, we are old, we have more or less than 32 teeth in our mouth. So we were old enough. We didn't grow up together. We were not socialized together. We were not schooled together. We have different philosophies, but we've been assigned particular responsibilities to execute. We have a responsibility to execute those responsibilities, but we work for one government. The problem arises when I, in executing my responsibilities and safeguarding my functions, think that I will not listen to the other person and be able to work with them when I lack the emotional intelligence, the maturity to be able to work with the other person pursuing the same goals. Because to my understanding, for example, the SARS, the AG, FIC, the National Treasury all have a common responsibility to combat illicit financial flows. In executing that responsibility, they may have different mandates, including the NPA and the Hawks. They may have different mandates, but they all have to collaborate, to cooperate, not only because the legislation requires them to do so, but because it's in the interest of the state to combat illicit financial flows and ensure that South Africa's resources remain in South Africa. They have a responsibility to cooperate, to be able to put their respective and their common heads towards the same purpose. So you need the maturity of leadership and the emotional intelligence to be able to work together towards a common purpose. You also need the leadership to have the ability to lead their respective subordinates to also work towards that common purpose. And so everything revolves around the leadership. The leadership is the fulcrum around which everything revolves. Now, that becomes the critical issue. The legislation can only do so much in fostering collaboration and defining the common purpose. At the end of the day, the warm bodies that occupy leadership positions have got to exercise that responsibility. That when the Border Management Authority is established, it would also involve the Border Management Authority to serve the same purpose. It has been a particular concern to me, even in my capacity as Minister of Home Affairs, when there has been an instance where we had to, at Home Affairs, go to arbitration and even court with the AG to resolve certain audit issues that ultimately had to be resolved both first in court, then in arbitration, that we could have resolved through thorough discussion and understanding. But it seems that there has been instances in recent times when there are matters that just people dig in their heels and are unable to resolve, that can be resolved through thorough engagement and understanding of what the legislation sought to achieve and what we can do with flexibility without undermining the purpose of the legislation but to achieve the purpose for which the legislation was established in the first instance. And so we need to use these instances as lessons to try and get ourselves to that level where we are able to rely on the leadership to resolve those issues. And I think what the judge is asking me is an absolutely fundamental question, which speaks, as I say, to the emotional intelligence and the maturity of leadership. Because at the end of the day, as the judge asks correctly, the leadership is the fulcrum around which everything resolves. The legislation can only do so much. At the end of the day, if the people who occupy the leadership positions fail to exercise the leadership and with flexibility and without undermining the ultimate purpose of the legislation, still are able to be flexible enough to resolve difficult issues, then it would mean that the legislation itself would remain compromised, because we would always have to keep changing the leadership, because then we would have robots that just cannot understand what their responsibility is to implement and execute their mandates.
And in a public enterprise, one would expect, particularly,
I suspect you would agree, leadership to recognize that they're accountable to the public, they're accountable to Parliament, they're accountable to, well, generally the population at large. If there are problems, they should explain them. Do you agree with that?
Yes, you know, we always have to, and at times, even when, at all times, we have to be able to understand that and to be able to explain ourselves and account to those various institutions, because even though no legislation will say to you, especially when you are employed as a bureaucrat in particular, what we always remind the public servants, for example at Home Affairs, is that you are a servant of the public. You are a servant of the public. When we employ you, we may not say to you, you need to account to the public, but the very title that you carry with you as a public servant means that you must be able to explain to the public and account to the public for what you do, and it's inborn in what you do, and I think for people at senior levels, they need to have that understanding even more than those who occupy middle or junior management positions in the public service.
Anything else?
Advocate Simon, before we move to the next questions, I just want to understand, Minister, you said you did have discussions with the Commissioner regarding the problems that have been highlighted even internationally. During those discussions, did he acknowledge the problems, and did he share with you what plans we have to deal with those problems in light of the impact of the issues which were raised both nationally, both in South Africa and internationally on revenue collection?
Indeed, we in the international roadshows, we went along with the Commissioner. I remember in the April roadshow to Washington, New York, and Boston, the Commissioner, I invited the Commissioner to join us. And so in the meetings of the World Bank, the IMF, the meetings with the ratings agencies in Washington, the meetings with investors in New York and Boston, the Commissioner was there, so he heard it himself, what they were raising, including responding to the questions they were and concerns they were raising about the the Revenue Service. And we also invited him to some other meetings domestically. So, and I met with the commissioner on a one-on-one, and I met with the executives of SARS, I think twice or thrice, if I'm not mistaken, and they explained to me the programs they were implementing to respond to some of the issues which had been raised, including the issues of the lack of capacity to combat illicit financial flows, the issues of dealing with what was being referred to as the brain drain, the issues of dealing with the integrity of the commission, and all of those matters, the management of some of the prominent cases that were being dealt with. So they did indicate to me, and I did feedback to them my own views about some of the issues which they were raising and how I thought they needed to deal with them. But I think ultimately I felt that we needed to propose a commission, because I thought responding to the singular issues was not adequate. It would ultimately not give us and the concerned public and stakeholders a comprehensive enough response and picture that would give a guarantee that we are responding adequately and comprehensively to the concerns and issues that were being raised.
If we can move off this topic. Minister, we received a submission from the acting commissioner.
I've got a bout of flu.
We received a submission from the acting commissioner a day or so ago. The purpose, he says, is to inform the Commission of information that has come into his possession regarding a trip by the suspended Commissioner to Russia in 2017. And we have here dated the 18th of November 2017, a request from Commissioner Moyani to you as Minister of Finance, entitled Urgent Request for Approval for the SARS Commissioner, Mr. Tom Moyani, to travel to Russia, Moscow, from 18 November until 23rd November. I believe it was signed by Mr. Moyani on the 17th of November and by the Minister on the 18th. And the background is, I quote, "There's an urgent need for me to meet with the head of the Russian Federal Tax Service to collaborate and sign off on a tax matter which requires me to travel to Moscow urgently. I'm available to discuss this matter in detail if the Minister wishes." The acting commissioner says the following: standard protocol on all international travel where the commissioner is traveling is: 1, a request is either received from a foreign jurisdiction sending an invitation, or we are requiring a visit to a foreign tax authority. Our international relations team initiate a request for a visit detailing the background. Secondly, once confirmation or invite is received, the foreign travel submission is prepared, giving detail to allow the minister to approve. Third, no bookings can be made prior to receiving the ministerial approval. Fourth, on completion of the trip must be acquitted with all the costs as well as a report which must be provided to the Minister on the trip. In this case, the following should be noted. Ministerial approval was granted for the trip with no information regarding the purpose of the trip. It simply speaks to, quote, sign off on a tax matter. This trip was signed off on the same day as the travel. The international relations team in SARS were not aware of the trip. The ministry has no further information on the trip. I have written to the Commissioner, that's Mr. Moyane, asking him for details of the trip, as well as the report to which no response has been received. I have asked various parties in SARS as well as his office, and they are not aware of the trip or its purpose. His conclusion is, I would like the Commission to note the fact that the circumstances and secrecy of this trip are very suspicious, and if no specific matter was addressed, such expenditure is fruitless and wasteful and would be in breach of the PFMA. Minister, perhaps you can tell us what the purpose of the trip was and why you felt that you should sign off on it.
You know, I think I am in line with the acting commissioner on this one, that I think the commissioner should be required to provide detail. It does happen in government that there are urgent trips that are that come up, that authorities request ministerial approval for, and you have to sign off because they are urgent and they travel. They provide detail for it. They provide reports afterwards for such trips. So in this case, the request indicated that it's for an urgent tax matter that needed to be signed off. Now, in this regard, when such requests come, you take it that it's a matter that that involves tax issues, and some of these tax issues are confidential. They obviously don't get explained in submissions, and that proper reports are going to be provided after the trips are undertaken. And I expected that it's part of the protocol of procedure on issues of this nature, and so that's why it was signed off. And so if SARS itself was not aware and there are no reports that are available, and the trip itself is not known to SARS, and there are no documentation available to SARS, I myself would be keen, like the acting commissioner, to know what was then the purpose of the trip, where was the trip going to, and therefore necessary procedures must be undertaken to ensure that such information is availed and the resources be claimed back.
So, Minister, just for clarity, did you ask the Commissioner for details on why he needed to go before you signed?
No, I usually would not, because a submission is provided. Because whenever there is a submission for the Commissioner to travel, I signed off on the submission and took it that the information provided to me, I relied on the integrity of the person and never thought that the person would provide me with wrongful information. I think and expected that a report would be submitted, and so surely, should it emanate afterwards that the information provided to me was wrong, then disciplinary procedure would be undertaken afterwards.
And Minister, did you get any feedback from the Commissioner after his trip?
No.
No.
I did not get any information. And if I had, you see, if I had any cause to doubt the reason or the authenticity of the request, I would have sought the explanation. And if afterwards I had any information that necessitated me to question the reason why the trip was undertaken, then I would have also sought information. Clearly, after the trip is undertaken, as is procedure even with ministers, we are supposed to provide a report to the president for the president to know why you had gone, what is the report pertaining to the trip you had undertaken. The same is expected of the people who have undertaken trips. I think in the period between November and March, a lot was happening. Preparations for the ruling party conference, preparations for the budget. I got preoccupied with those things, and the report pertaining to this report would have slipped through during that time. But after that, I surely would have had time to request reports relating to all of these trips, and I would have had occasion to say, but there is this trip, the report of which has not been provided to me. Can I get a report relating to that trip, and then take necessary steps about it?
But you didn't.
No, I didn't, because I didn't have time afterwards to do it. As you know, at the end of February, I had to, there was a reshuffle that took place.
That's right.
Yes.
And finally, so can we then infer from what you're saying that when you received that request, your alarm bells didn't go off? You didn't suspect at that stage there was something suspicious?
They didn't go off because the Commissioner of the Revenue Service travels of necessity quite a lot for a number of reasons to different countries. Russia being one of the BRICS countries, I did not have any reason to suspect that there was anything wrong, unless somebody would have provided to me reason to suspect anything. At that time, nobody provided any such reason to suspect anything. I honestly did not suspect anything.
I ask because the acting commissioner suggests that there's usually a full motivation for the trip, and this one is conspicuous in that it's missing that.
The only difference being that this was an urgent request. And so if it was a normal request, that says, Minister, I request to travel within a week or 2 weeks. If it was not an urgent request, I would have written back to say, this request doesn't provide me any detail. Can you elaborate? As you would notice in a number of submissions that would have been provided to me in my time as Minister of Public Enterprises, in my time as Minister of Home Affairs, in my time as Minister of Finance, I would have commented on requests for travel that you are requesting for travel for the following officials. You don't explain to me why each one of these officials is doing on the following trip. Why are you requesting travel for 3 instead of 2 or instead of 1? Why are you suggesting this or that? I would have commented on a number of those trips, but this was a request for urgent travel to sign off on urgent tax matters. And so I expected that there would be a report provided to me afterwards, since it was also for a 3-day. It was also a 3-day travel request. So I thought there would be a report submitted afterwards. And certainly, if there was anything wrong that I came to know about afterwards, necessary action would have been taken on my part to deal with that. And unfortunately, at the time the request came, no information or allegation which would have caused suspicion on my part had come to my attention, and therefore I didn't have any reason to be suspicious of anything, even as the acting commissioner raises that issue now. They also are not indicating what, other than saying there is no information, there are no protocols followed, they are not saying exactly what is the wrong thing that was done. And that's why I'm saying I'm on their side in seeking to find out if there was wrongdoing, what exactly therefore was the purpose of the trip, what was being signed off, and why the commission did not know.
Judge, I don't have further questions, but perhaps you and the panel do.
Can I just have clarity on
Yeah.
that? When was that trip? What year?
2017, November 2017.
And under the protocols, to whom should the commissioner report after the trip? To the minister? Or
To the minister.
And when was the letter written by the acting commissioner requesting?
The information from
Yes.
Mr. Moyani,
Yes.
I think very recently.
You don't have the date there.
I'll look for it.
Well, we can deal with it later. Thank you. Anything you want to?
On my side, Judge, just to understand, Minister, am I correct in understanding you to say when there was reference to a meeting concerning urgent tax matter, you considered it something that would fit within sort of taxpayer matters which would therefore be subject to confidentiality? Do I understand you right on that?
I thought it could be that, or it could be a tax protocol or tax MOU issues, because if it's the South African head of revenue service and head of tax administration in Russia, I considered it to be issues relating to memoranda of agreement between the two countries, that there could be issues of cooperation between the two countries that needed to be signed off on an urgent basis, and so allowed the trip to go on, and then we will get the explanation and the full report afterwards.
The reason I'm asking, I'm trying to understand whether an approach would have been different. For example, if it's dealing with tax memoranda, which are international agreements,
Yeah.
would you have expected more information upfront, as opposed to if you're dealing with, for example, a taxpayer matter, which by its nature would be considered to be confidential, and you would have taken a different approach there. Am I understanding you right?
You are right. But as I say, I thought that it's issues of an urgent matter relating to taxation issues that could not wait, and so they needed to be acted on with immediate effect, and any delay probably could be disadvantageous to either individuals or both countries, and so that's why I considered the matter I considered it necessary to allow the matter to proceed.
In the ordinary course, in relation to matters concerning, for example, international agreements, would there not have been pre-approval for that?
There would have been pre-approval. Surely, if he had put the matter directly as to sign off on an agreement, I would have said that, look, wait, I've not seen the draft agreement. And an agreement surely would require that the political authorities, the heads of tax authorities, the political heads of tax authorities in both countries must first converse. We must study. The state law advisor must advise us on whether. So I would have said, no, wait a minute, this is not urgent. But given the matter it is put here to sign off on a tax matter which requires me to travel urgently, I consider that to be a matter which is sensitive and urgent, and let's allow it to happen, and I will get a report afterwards.
Judge, the date that Mr. Kingan wrote to Mr. Moyani is the 28th of August 2018. That's all on this topic.
Is there more topics to deal with the minister?
There's one more topic, and that's the Border Management Authority Bill. Minister and Mr. Africa, if I can just briefly summarize for you, we've had submissions from three sources on this bill, from senior customs officials within SARS, from the South African Freight Forwarding Association, and from National Treasury. And they all express the same concern. And that's that this bill is going to hamper SARS's capacity to enforce the laws with regard to customs and excise. And it's also going to slow down the process for business who are conveying the cargo. And from SARS's point of view, it's that at the moment they are able to have sight and visibility of the full value chain, including from foreign jurisdictions through their agreements, so that they can track the passage of any cargo from anywhere in the world to South Africa and then out of South Africa if necessary. The Treasury said that they think the risk to the economy is of about 300 billion rand if this goes wrong. And those are certainly the sort of figures that the Freight Association was talking about. Obviously, it also, if there are gaps in that value chain, there are holes opened up for illicit trade. And Treasury said they are absolutely in favor of legislation that mandates coordination between the various agencies and departments. But that this bill has been put forward with no study underpinning exactly how this should happen. And therefore, the fear is from all three sources that there will be fragmentation in the value chain, and the left hand won't know what the right hand is doing if Home Affairs is brought into the picture in this manner. I think that's a summary of the problems, and perhaps you can respond to it from your side.
Thank you very much. I have the unenviable role of having been on both sides of the spectrum in this debate. Though my views have remained consistent in that I've favored the Border Management Authority for right throughout. I will perhaps ask Mr. Africa to make more extensive remarks in this regard, but let me make few remarks. The first one is that, in actual fact, the Border Management Authority Bill recognizes wholeheartedly the role of SARS in revenue collection. It neither hampers nor divides it. It recognizes, and that's why the bill was amended to insert a clause that says all revenue collected will go into the National Revenue Fund. So there's no division of where the revenue goes, because we made it very clear from Home Affairs from the outset that we have absolutely no intention of retaining any funds collected from the customs function at the ports of entry. which after all constitute 10% of all customs functions in relations to the importation of goods to South Africa. In that regard, I know National Treasury has said it's 20% of goods that that come through the ports of entry. So whether it's 10 or 20%, ultimately, even the fines that are collected there will be deposited into the National Revenue Fund. So there will be no hampering of revenue collection. Therefore, the risk to collection of 300 billion rand seems like a thumbsuck. It's based on nothing except probably a scarecrow to create a perception that there will be so much amount of money that's going to be lost, when in actual fact, that money collected, whichever amount, will go directly into the revenue fund.
Minister, sorry to interrupt you. The problem that SARS and the Freight Association and Treasury have is not where the money will go. It's that what will be hampered is SARS' ability to collect that money, because there will be communication gaps. SARS will lose sight of the value chain or will lose control of the value chain, and therefore will be unable to collect the money, rather than where the money will end up. I think there's no argument about that.
But it's immaterial,
Sorry,
is it?
Excuse me, Minister, just 1 minute. Ms. Steinberg, isn't this a debate better had in Parliament? Is this really a matter in our terms of reference?
Judge, it is to the extent that we are concerned with the way in which tax and customs should be governed. Recommendations in that regard.
But is this a governance issue?
Well, I think the governing legislation is preeminently a governance issue.
Well, yes, I must say,
I'm pretty much inclined towards the direction of the judge on this matter. Well, I was a bit confused, particularly on what we're aiming at looking at. Are we looking at whether should, and I'm not so sure, of course, I don't know the bill, is the bill requiring that the responsibilities in relation to the collection of customs revenue, which are currently SARS responsibilities, to be actually carried out by different agencies? Is that what is?
Yes.
But I still hold, even in that, would hold the view that that's ultimately a matter of the legislature to determine that, having a bearing on, amongst others, the constitutional authority of the minister to introduce money bills and related matters. The Minister of Finance in relation to money bills.
I have no problem with leaving it there.
You want to put it on the No, I think that I'm not sure that it's the right thing for us to decide on what Parliament should be looking at. So perhaps we shouldn't go down this road. Is it okay?
That's fine with me. Yeah.
Is there anything further?
I have nothing further unless the Minister has something in addition to say on anything.
No. No. I think I have nothing. I think I just would like to draw the attention of the Commission just in conclusion. No. I think no. I have nothing further. I think.
Well, thank you very much for your time. We appreciate it, and it's been very informative.
Thank you very much.
Thank you, Minister.
Thank you. I appreciate it too.
Judge, our next witness is Minister Nene.
Good morning, Minister.
Good morning,
Thank you
Judge.
very much for coming and giving us your time. I'm sure you're a very busy man, but thank you very much indeed. Would you just affirm that what you tell us will be the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth? So will you just say, I do?
I do.
Thank you.
Morning, Minister Nene.
Good morning.
You were the Minister of Finance between the 25th of May 2014 and the 9th of December 2015. And you are again the Minister of Finance. And we'll ask you questions relating to both of those periods. We've heard evidence from Bain that part of the assurance they had in implementing the new operating model was that the Commissioner assured them that the Minister of Finance had given his approval to the new operating model. And I'm aware that Commissioner Moyane sent you as Minister of Finance 2 short memoranda relating to this, the first being on the 11th of November 2014 and the second being on the 5th of August 2015. And perhaps you can comment on what it was that you approved.
Thank you. Indeed, there were two letters or 2 memoranda. The first was a request, if I were to say that the reason for the application to procure Bain's or to proceed with the process was in order to relaunch the SARS brand. It says in the memo, it is imperative that I quote from the memo, that I begin the process of relaunching the SARS brand by embarking on a comprehensive overhaul of the organization in all aspects. My intention is to strengthen and revitalize the governance and ethical framework so that the organization makes a fresh start after the toils of the past 2 years. As you would know, during that time, it was just immediately after the unceremonious departure of the previous commissioner. So the organization was indeed in a difficult phase. He went on to then state the areas that he would like to enhance: the revenue collection, operational performance, the SARS infrastructure, organization and governance, and the image and perception. So the intentions were noble indeed, and it was for that reason that he was given the go-ahead. Let me also indicate that this was an operational matter, and the minister only had to endorse the process, with the hope also that once the implementation proceeds, it will be reported on. Progress would be reported to the minister with regards to the achievement of the objectives that I have referred to.
It's correct that in terms of the SARS Act, the Commissioner merely has to advise the Minister on these kind of operational matters. And in fact, we have an affidavit from Minister Gordon who says that he in fact tried to stop Mr. Moyane from implementing the final phase of the new operating model relating to customs, but that the Commissioner ignored him and defied him. Which will lead us to the second topic, which is really the question of governance and how the relationship between the ministry and the commissioner can perhaps be strengthened. But before we go there, I wonder if there are any questions about the first topic, which is what it is that the minister approved in terms of the new operating model. Please, Professor Katz.
Minister, what I'm understanding from you, you simply approved the process, not the result of the process.
Correct.
So these were the categories that they wanted to look at, and you approved that, nothing more.
Which made sense, because for any organization, in order for it, if you want to revitalize the organization and to improve its efficiency, it is important. And we've had a number of such at the
Thanks. Minister, there's reference there to a comprehensive overhaul. When you make reference to approving the process, where you're approving the process to give rise to a comprehensive overhaul.
Look, there was going to be a process to arrive at the overhaul, but it meant that the organization, in the view of the new commissioner, did need an overhaul. So it would have then have been of assistance to see which areas, and the areas are mentioned, that you want to enhance the revenue collection. You want to make sure that those areas are strengthened. So indeed, it might, even though overhaul might actually be a very strong word, but the intention is an intention of improving the efficiency and efficacy.
Just one last question. This matter was brought before you, Minister, for approval. But was your approval really necessary for this? And I suspect it's going to be a matter that follows the theme around the governance and the decision-making powers as between the minister and the commissioner. Was it really a matter that required the minister's approval to go ahead, or could it have gone ahead without the minister's approval?
Indeed, it would have gone ahead without the minister's approval, but I think it was only, as he said, I mean, in the second memo, you'd see that he says it's the confirmation and concurrence, but ultimately, approval actually is only in principle, but other than that, it is just concurring or endorsing more than anything in terms of the legislation. The commissioner could have proceeded without the minister because it's an operational matter.
Steinbeck, sorry, what is the date of the first memorandum?
It's the 11th of November
Of
2014. Minister, the second memorandum, it does in fact include an annexure called Update on the organizational model, and one of the documents here is that final operating model, that organogram that we saw yesterday, that was given. But I must comment that, Minister, we were looking at that yesterday afternoon, and frankly it took us hours to understand the implications of that organogram, and we had the consultants who designed it to explain to us. So I guess you get something like this, and it's not entirely clear what the implications are.
Indeed, and again, when a person who is closely related to the business, because other than the narrative also, because my focus was more on the narrative that this organogram is going to strengthen the hand of SARS in performing its duties, as you would have seen that among other things, it is the area of the large business center and the other elements being brought together. But it turned out, with hindsight now, it turned out also that it didn't actually achieve that intended objective. And I would have then also hoped that with a professional company which was advising, and in fact the company that was advising was a company that had advised one of our institutions, the Development Bank of Southern Africa, and was able to actually turn it around. I found it very strange that in this instance, that very same company produced a different outcome, and therefore it was my belief and conviction that the intention is indeed to strengthen the
Minister, that's interesting, because one of the areas we were probing yesterday with Bain was the significance of their stamp of approval on the new operating model. And we suggested to them that in the context of a public organization rather than a private one, where an internationally, an international company with a good reputation gives its stamp of approval, it's something that the Minister would rely on, and you're confirming that.
Indeed. Yeah, that is why, I mean, judging by what I heard from yesterday's engagement with me, I'm utterly disappointed.
Can I move off this topic?
Minister, you mentioned, in respect of the first memo, you mentioned one of the reasons as being, provided for the complete overhaul as being the impact of the unceremonious departure of the previous commissioner. In your view, as the minister at the time, was there a huge negative impact, especially on revenue collection and staff morale, as a result of the events that happened at that time?
It was more of the reputational damage to the organization that had actually ensued as a result of that. But of course, that would consequentially, have an impact also on staff morale. But it wasn't at that time, as you would know, what would be able to show that would be these subsequent engagements with the organization. And it also did have an impact on the morale of the staff.
So that would have justified the changes, the complete overhaul in the organization as proposed by the Commission?
Look, more than anything, as long as it addresses the issues that are mentioned, because if you look at strengthening and revitalizing the governance and ethical framework, and then it talks to, if anything that would bring revenue, for me, is music. If somebody says, what I'm going to do is going to improve revenue collection, which is what I always preach, because even now, under very tough economic conditions, the only thing I preach, they all are breathing 1,345, which is 1.345, 1,345 million that I'm looking for this year under tough conditions. So it's revenue, revenue, and revenue. But more than that, operational performance, the infrastructure, organization and governance, all of those, if we could enhance them, it is something that I would really go along with.
Am I getting you right, Minister, that you didn't necessarily share the view that the institution had been in turmoil, but you simply were of the view that the institution needed enhancements?
In order to also inspire confidence,
Yeah.
that is true.
Well, may I just ask you, Minister, did you yourself think it needed enhancement, or are you relying on the Commissioner's view that it needs?
Look, there is no room for complacency in an institution like SARS. All the commissioners that have come in have always tried to take it to the next level. As we will have seen in the first turnaround, where I had the privilege of serving in Parliament, and the focus with the then Commissioner Gordon was actually a series of those, reviews, and one of the panelists actually was part of assisting the turnaround way back. But and after that, when the other commissioner, Mr. Mahashula, came in, we built on the strength of what had been achieved by the previous one. So I would have then thought that if somebody comes in and we are in the environment that we are in, it is important that we actually step up the game.
Minister, we'd like to hear your views on the governance question, the question of the relationship between the ministry and SARS. You've been in the unique position of being minister while a number of different commissioners have reported to you. We're interested in hearing about what you think the weaknesses in the current system are and how you think they may be improved.
Firstly, I think the relationship between the minister and the commissioner are critical, even though, I think the legislation itself does not, provide a clear framework in order to be able to execute that. Because the minister being the executive authority and the commissioner being the accounting authority of the institution, with the appointment being at a presidential level. The anomaly is when the president appoints and the minister signs the employment contract, and and that's what regulates the relationship from there. But also there is the SARS Act, there is also the Public Finance Management Act, and I think there does need to be some kind of alignment in order to be able to regulate that. But at times it also entirely relies on personalities, because you might have all the the governance framework in place, but personalities also do play a role in that environment. And I must say that during that period of from 2014 to 2015, we were almost working on an environment where we first had a period of an acting commissioner for some time who had been in the system for a long time. So personalities came into play and it was much smoother. But then we had to deal with a new commissioner coming in, having to allow him space without second guessing the new commissioner. And that was for a very short period, because it was towards the end of 2014, and in 2015 the reporting period, 2014 at the end of the financial year, had more to do with the previous commissioner, and I left then before the finalization of the reporting period. But the engagements one has, which are more of monthly meetings, as an oversight instrument for the minister, they actually proved to be very useful, because that's where you are able to monitor and manage the performance, getting regular reporting. But again, during that period, I think because of the change of personalities and the introduction of a number of other governance, or not necessarily governance, but operational measures, and an underperforming economy, one had to also be faced with a situation where performance on the revenue side was the main and the key issue. And you'd recall that during that time there were issues with regards to the so-called rogue unit at SARS, and when I realized that that was beginning to take away the attention of the commissioner from focusing on the core function of the organization, we then had to appoint a minister's advisory committee to be able to deal with those matters, rather than having the commissioner focusing on them. I recall saying that you are now between three judges as the commissioner. We had the Davis Tax Committee looking at strengthening our tax collection and revenue side, and we also had Judge Kroon looking at these reputational issues, but also looking at governance as well. And we also had, on the other side, had just since about 2014 again, or 2013, we had the office of the tax ombud. So with three judges, what more would you be asking for?
Minister, what everyone seems to agree on is that it's the personality of the incumbents that counts more than anything else, because you can't legislate a relationship in detail. Minister Gordon says in his words that the organizational effectiveness, credibility and reputation of a tax authority is determined by the integrity of its leadership, their technical skill and knowledge and expertise and experience, and accountability and transparency. Now, based on that, he then puts a lot of emphasis on the appointment procedure, as it's critical as to who gets the job and how they're vetted. And he makes a number of recommendations in that regard. I wonder if you could start by telling us what the current appointment procedure is and how Mr. Moyane was in fact appointed.
Firstly, the appointment is by the President, as I said earlier. Once the President has, because you first receive applications, there is an advert and people apply. I'm informed here by my Director General, Don Mkhajana, that he was actually Chief of Staff when the applications came to the department, and it then, I think there were about 127 applicants, and which then the names would then be forwarded to the presidency, and then the presidency would then make its selection, and once the president has arrived at a name to appoint through his processes, there would then be a presidential minute that would be signed by the minister and the president, and the person is so appointed. When a person has been appointed, and that's what happened with Mr. Moyane, and when a person is appointed, then the minister and the commissioner enter into an employment agreement which is signed by both.
So do I understand correctly that 127 applications came in and that President Zuma selected one out of those 127, and that was the procedure?
Well, I wouldn't be privy to the process of shortlisting until arriving, but the only time then we enter the process again is when the president has made his choice.
What Minister Gordon suggests instead, and perhaps you can comment on this, is that there should be wide advertising and then shortlisting and then rigorous interviews and competence testing. And he says the shortlisting process should take account at least of academic and technical qualifications, relevant management experience, leadership experience of large complex organizations, a detailed and deep functional understanding of the relationship between SARS, the Treasury, and the broader economy of South Africa, a track record of integrity and professional service, and the ability to credibly communicate with the public at large. He also says that the shortlisting process should make provision in accordance with normal executive practice for participation by current office bearers in senior positions in SARS and the Treasury, and may include participation by registered tax practitioners and civil society. Following shortlisting, interviews and competence testing should be conducted, and thereafter a recommendation should be made by the executive authority through the Department of Public Service and Administration to Cabinet, taking account of the results of the selection process. That recommendation should lead to the appointment by the President or his or her nominee in consultation with Cabinet. What are your views on that proposal?
Well, that's a very rich and elaborate, account of from a veteran in both areas, both in the institution of SARS, but also as Minister of Finance. And also, I think it is informed by experience in that area for what has happened. I would support anything that would improve the integrity of the process. I wouldn't want to go into the detail of to which parts of it I would support and perhaps would like to have a different view. But I think anything that would actually result in the selection of the best candidate for the job, but also a candidate that would inspire the confidence and the integrity of the institution that it requires.
I think Professor Katz, you have a question here.
Well,
Please.
Minister, this is a very comprehensive process, giving lots of stakeholders an opportunity. The one thing it doesn't have, be grateful to have your views, do you think it needs any parliamentary intervention?
That's why I said I did not want to go into detail, because that's precisely the point I would have actually made. That I think Parliament might actually, it might make sense for Parliament to be part of the process. But at the risk of, such an elaborate process might actually have its own downside of perhaps being, quite cumbersome and might take long. In instances where, like at the moment where we have acting commissioners, where you have an acting commissioner that the legislation provides for a period of 3 months, of 90 days at any given time to appoint. So I think one of the things that should be looked into also is how the process can actually be structured such that its elaborate nature does not result in it taking long.
Minister Gordon and Mr. Magashula also say that once the appointment's been made, they recommend that the current reporting systems between the Commissioner and the Minister be formalised and strengthened, because it seemed to be a question of practice, but not one of necessity. And it broke down entirely. The Treasury told us a couple of days ago that that relationship, that reporting and account, the ability for the Minister to play that check and balance role broke down because the regular meetings between the Commissioner and the Minister just stopped happening. So the suggestion here is that be formalised, and that there be a requirement that there are, quote, granular and particular reports prepared by SARS to ensure thorough oversight. Would you agree with that, Minister?
Indeed, I would really support that. I think it is important, as I said, that whilst the regulatory framework does not necessarily produce those results, but it is important so that even when personalities are at odds, but at least there is something that regulates the relationship.
Mr. Kakle.
Minister, I just wanted to understand, I'd like to understand how that relationship worked with you and the current Commissioner. And perhaps I'm trying to figure out whether in terms of practice it worked well for you, or you would have required a few things to be put in place to make it better, and especially because this issue has been raised around personalities. It may well have not worked well between the Commissioner and Minister Gordon, but it may have worked perfectly for you. And when I talk about you, I also look at it from the expectations of the Treasury. Did you see that relationship working well?
Look, there's no perfect relationship, but there could be a professional relationship in an environment where we share the same objective. And I must say, in the period that I worked with the Commissioner, we had a number of issues to deal with, and as I said earlier, I reached a point, there were some instances, like I said, I ended up having to appoint the Crown Commission because I felt that the Commissioner was paying too much attention to the so-called rogue unit rather than focusing on on the revenue collection, which is the core function. And but I think we handled that matter quite maturely. But I continue to have my reservations in terms of, from time to time, having to, call the commissioner to order in order to focus on revenue collection.
What troubles me a bit, Minister, is that we've heard evidence of
Not a strained relationship with Treasury, such that meetings that used to be held are no longer held. There's an issue of the Commissioner taking the Auditor General to court, which is a most unusual situation and suggests a very strained relationship there. There's a strained relationship with, apparently, with the Davis Commission. We'll hear about that, I believe Judge Davis is here. There's a strained relationship with the Financial Intelligence Center. Does that not all trouble you? It troubles me that there should be so many strained relationships.
It does, indeed it does, because it also goes to the heart of, a fully functional institution, because if there are those relationship issues. And I think during my tenure, especially during the 2015 period, the focus was more on for me, saying let's focus on the revenue collection. I understand these are the issues, and if they need to be dealt with, there is a place for them to be dealt with. But let's focus on revenue collection. And I must say that during that period, our monthly meetings did take place, and we actually were very robust in dealing with focus on revenue collection. Indeed, there was beginning to be an issue with regards to inability to meet our targets, both as a result of an underperforming economy, but at the same time, not paying adequate attention to closing the tax gap. But that now was also parallel with the study that was being conducted by Bain on the other side, hoping that when that is concluded, which unfortunately I was not around to be able to to see the outcome. But some of those results, and as you say, they might have been part of the engagement between SARS and the Davis Committee as well, because they would be presented to the Crown Committee, which was an advisory to the minister, but I never got to see the final outcome.
I have no more questions for the Minister here.
Thanks so much. Minister, in the presentation by Bain yesterday, it submitted or suggested that the issues that bedevil SARS had lesser to do with what it proposed to SARS in relation to the structure than the leaders that had to operate that structure. What's your impression of that? I mean, you saw the outcome around what was proposed. Did you expect what was proposed what was brought to you following the Bain process would result in what actually is said to have resulted in relation to the ineffectiveness of SARS?
As I said, I'm disappointed because it was the direct opposite of what my expectations were. I would have expected that it would actually enhance the operations and it would improve the performance of the institution. And it is indeed quite disappointing that was not the case. And as I said earlier also about Bain, that I actually feel something must have gone wrong with that organization.
But you share Bain's view that it was not so much what they proposed than the people, the warm bodies that had to operate within what was proposed. That it was actually an issue of leadership that resulted in the ineffectiveness. Leadership within the institution rather than the structure of the organization.
Well, but that's, I would imagine that's the same leadership that had actually called for that, for those recommendations, and I would imagine that they would be better placed to implement them. And if it is the same leadership also that was not able, then there is a bit of a challenge. I mean, I don't have an opinion on whether Bain only thinks. I mean, it could be in their defense to say, no, it's not what we presented, it's the people. But I haven't had an opportunity actually of studying their presentation.
I suppose the reason I'm asking this question is that at the end of the exercise, there was a report, my understanding, around what was to happen. You were comfortable in terms of what was on paper required to happen would meet the objectives that had been raised with you at the start of the process.
Yes.
Sorry, may I?
Please.
Mr. One of the important elements of our terms of reference is a governance framework for SARS. We've discussed the appointment of the commissioner. Now the commission is appointed. The governance processes thereafter. There are two compartments: tax issues, non-tax issues. On the non-tax issues, one of the things we're looking at, and we also will ask Judge Dennis Davis, is the possibility of an oversight board on the non-tax issues, which would pick up early warnings of problems in SARS, administrative issues. What would your view be on a board that would serve as an oversight of the administrative functions, not the tax functions of SARS?
I would support that, and I think it would also fill the gap of not always having to appoint advisory panels from time to time and having commissions, because at least you will have that oversight institutionalized.
Minister, the appointment of senior management of SARS in terms of the SARS Act should be done with the approval of the minister. Now, looking at the events that happened while you were still the Minister of Finance previously, during the previous period of 2015, especially around or which affected the senior staff members at SARS, the exodus of the most experienced staff members. Would the strain in the relationship between the ministry and the commissioner have prevented the minister in intervening in any way or in assisting in any way with the events which affected the senior staff members?
The issue of the senior staff members was actually a bit of a tricky one, because as you would know, the limits within which the minister also exercises his oversight in terms of that area. Where there would be issues between the commissioner and executive and his executive, you would allow for due processes to unfold, and unfortunately some of them actually would have resulted in some of those voluntarily leaving, and it turns out now that some of them were not necessarily voluntary departures. But there were a number of areas that were very concerning at that time, and but the minister would intervene to the extent that the minister would be able to get information from the commissioner, and the commissioner would explain the reasons for issues at hand. But that's only how far the minister could go. Than that, you would be micromanaging the institution.
Minister, one last question from my side. The question of SARS bonuses. Your DG and his team showed us that during years where SARS was in fact under-collecting, they voted themselves large bonuses for top leadership. Mr. Gordon's suggestion on this count is that it's appropriate for the Minister of Finance to approve bonuses and executive remuneration as recommended by the Human Resource Committee contemplated by the SARS Act. Would you agree with that?
I fully support that view.
Yeah, there does seem to be no sense in somebody approving their own bonus.
Own bonus, yeah.
Okay.
Quick follow-up on this, Minister. The bonuses that were paid during the period you were Minister, would those have been approved by the Minister, or would they have been approved by SARS, excluding the Minister, without the Minister's approval?
I would have to go into the records because, again, as I said, at times you would find that even those things that could otherwise have been approved by the Commissioner would seek concurrence with the Minister. I would just have to go into the records to confirm.
Well, I think the position is that that was one of the areas of conflict, is that Mr. Gordon said these are times of austerity.
Correct.
And you shouldn't pay the bonuses to yourselves. And the Commissioner said, well, it's my decision, it's got nothing to do with you. And there was an area of conflict, and I think there are legal opinions. Am I right?
That's correct, Judge.
Yeah. But then during my period, I would just have to go into the records whether they actually were submitted to us for concurrence or not.
Perhaps you could let us know, Minister, in the fullness of time. Thank
I
you.
will assist with that.
Thank you very much, Minister, for giving us your views.
Yes, ma'am.
Thank you, Minister. DG, may I just ask you, has the
For the second time,
has the procurement officer come to give testimony today?
No. Is he coming? Yes.
He is coming.
He's coming after lunch, yes.
Oh, after lunch. Is that correct, Mr. Mamoni, at after lunch? Oh, okay, thank you.
Are we going to hear Judge Davis first or second?
We're going to hear Judge Davis first. Would it be convenient to take a break first?
I think if we're going to hear Judge Davis.
Ask me another question.